Welcome in, everybody. You are listening to the Authority Podcast on the B Podcast Network. Thanks, as always, for being with us. Excited to bring you a conversation here about public speaking. That topic, that monster in the closet for many of us, that fear that we've overcome, that thing that we can always continue to get better at, even if we've had a lot of experience and success. There's always new techniques, strategies, tips for reaching new audiences, and it can make all the difference. And certainly for you as leaders, something that makes an impact, right? So my guest is Ryan Millar. Ryan is a Canadian-born, Amsterdam-based coach, story trainer, and communications consultant. All of his work draws heavily on his 25 plus years as an improviser. He got his start in Vancouver, British Columbia in the late 90s with instant theater, and he's worked with Boom Chicago and toured Europe teaching and performing at festivals. His latest book is called The Confident Presenter. That's what we're talking about today. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Ross, thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Ryan, if I can start with potentially a dumb question, but one that could be helpful to our listeners. What is public speaking? And what are we talking about when we're referring to that? Does it take place in certain contexts and environments, or is it just anytime we're speaking to anybody? How would you define it?
Ross, that's not a dumb question. First of all, that's a great question. And I think when people think of public speaking, they imagine, standing in a meeting room or in a conference hall and, broadcasting to a big audience. But in fact, public speaking, if you break the words down, it's, you talking in public, so not in private, to someone else. So, I mean, you could play with those definitions a little bit and say, you talking to your partner and suggesting where you go on holiday. Maybe it's not public, but you're still communicating with someone else and trying to convey a point. You talking with your mates at the at the beach or at the ball game or at the out for dinner, all the way up to those examples I cited earlier of speaking in a more professional context. And I think they all count as public speaking, and they have the same root skills that we need to work on, or that I cover in the book. So they're applicable to different degrees in different contexts, but there's pretty much, it's the same bag of, I don't want to call them tricks, but let's call them bag of tricks.
Yeah. What did you notice that got you started with teaching public speaking? How did you identify that, I guess, as an area of need?
Well, I mean, this is how it happened for me. So first of all, I'm a middle child, so older brother, younger sister. So famously, middle children are quite keen for attention, let's say. And I was a performer since I was very young on stage, and I always loved being in the spotlight. And as I grew up, I more and more realized that was something that was kind of unique to me. And I found a channel for that, which was, as you mentioned in my intro, was improv comedy and improv theater. And as I grew up and that became more of a hobby and I was working professionally, I realized that quite a lot of people would have to give a presentation and would, I think by their own admission, struggle, or at least be uncomfortable and not enjoy the experience. For me, what that led me to do was to develop some teaching materials that were about learning to enjoy yourself more as a public speaker, as a presenter. Because the way I see it is that if you're uncomfortable when you're presenting, the audience, who always sort of mirrors what a public speaker is doing, is also then going to be uncomfortable. And if you are comfortable and relaxed, and of course, we hope that there's a good reason that you're comfortable and relaxed because you know what you're going to say, you're well prepared, et cetera, but the audience will then relax as well. And then you're in this positive cycle where you are getting more relaxed and you are enjoying it and the audience is enjoying it and are more receptive to your message. So it's like if you're in the vicious cycle, it's just going to get more uncomfortable and you're going to be more unhappy. But if you can turn that around, then it starts going the other direction. And that's what I want. That's the path I want to set people on.
Yeah. Is it fair to say, right, the title is The Confident Presenter, and that's covered in your introduction and in your story of getting into this work is noticing the importance of that confidence. And I'm wondering, is it fair to say that all effective public speakers are confident, but not all confident public speakers are effective? I was, thinking about speakers I've observed over the years, right? And of course, how important it is to convey confidence on the stage. Like you said, it's uncomfortable to listen to somebody who's clearly uncomfortable up there, no matter what they're saying. And, but of course, I'm sure that confidence itself doesn't necessarily mean that you're successfully communicating what you want to communicate as a speaker. But you tell me if that's accurate.
Oh, Ross, I think that's very accurate. And I think the amount of people who are confident without really having anything to back it up, it's not that many, but it's really noticeable if someone is up there and, talking and, sort of embarrassing themselves or whatever because they don't know what they're talking about. That doesn't happen very often, but, we all notice when it does. I think it's much more common that people who, in fact, should be very confident because they know all of the material. It's someone who's written their PhD on something, and then they get up and they have their face buried in their notes, or, they're hiding behind the lectern. They speak with, quite a soft voice, all of these things that sort of makes the audience like, oh, what's going on? And start shifting uncomfortably, looking at their watch. And then the person, even though they're buried in their notes, they can hear the tapping of the pencils, and they start speeding up and speaking, and it's just like, oh God, get me out of here. This is not, nobody is enjoying this. Nobody's learning anything. The person who's presenting is not getting the respect they deserve. And the people who are listening are not having their time valued because, the person who's presenting is not doing so in an effective way. And it's that kind of situation that I was like, that's what I want to avoid, or that's what I want to teach people, how to take control of their own, plane in that situation and maneuver, take flight and maneuver their presentation. And that was also why the book is written at I don't want to say an entry level, but I tried to write it so it's accessible to everyone. I think if you're already quite a confident and wonderful presenter, there will still be things in here that are valuable for you. And especially if you're not so comfortable and that's the kind of person who would be seeking out a book like The Confident Presenter, then you would get into that book and my book, and you would be like, oh, okay, great. So here's a couple of things I can do right away. And oh, already I'm feeling better. And that's what I wanted to accomplish.
Yeah, and I think part of what you just referenced brings up point react versus adapt to the audience, right? You mentioned sort of that reaction of, okay, it seems like they're bored. Let me speed up, and that maybe physiological response we may have if we're already nervous to say, let me just hurry up and get out of here.
Yeah.
Versus, I'm sure, and in different types of public speaking, at least, there can certainly be a more positive way of gauging audience response. Okay, I'm 5 minutes into this. Do I seem to have them interested and engaged? What's happening next? And it's making me wonder, one, I think part of it is maybe exploring what that connection is between improv and public speaking, and two things that at least what they have in common is that you have an audience, right? But there's other things where people may not necessarily think that they're the same. And I guess that also, relates to what is your perspective on memorization and how important it is to, have that entire presentation planned out, mapped out in your head versus having maybe an outline or an idea of where you want to go and then seeing how the audience is reacting to that, or is that case by case? But how do you approach that?
Ross, what I'm going to try and do here is I think there were two questions in there, and I'm going to try and answer them sequentially. And then if I don't, I want you to put me back on track. But the first question, I think, was about connection with the audience and sort of acknowledging what's going on in the moment. And the second question was about memorization. So the first question, I want to tell you a quick story which was I was teaching, I used to teach master classes for the Guardian newspaper in London called Learn to Love Presenting and Public Speaking, something like that. And one of these iterations, there's normally 40 people in this big meeting room, and we'd gone 3/4 of the way through our morning, and I was teaching a session on narrative structure. So it's like this, how do you make your story make sense? And what you're going to do is you're going to get into small groups, and you're going to, we're going to see how we can kind of, I can't remember what the exercise was exactly, but it was like, how can you kind of take an event and do a beginning, middle, and end? And I noticed that people were sort of looking at each other, and like it wasn't landing my instructions. And so I was like, okay, hold on. I'm sort of sensing a weird vibe in here. What is happening? Like, does this not make sense? What's going on? And someone spoke up and was like, Ryan, what if we're just scared? And I was like, oh, okay, I see what's happened. Is like it had worked with groups in the past, but for whatever reason, this dynamic, this group, they just weren't ready for the exercise, or, if you, to put it into public speaking terms, this next set of slides or this next section, because they weren't ready to move on. And so I was like, okay, what point in that moment is there for me to go, doesn't matter, sorry, suck it up, here we go. You got to do, we got lunch coming in half an hour. We got to get to do this exercise, right? So I just went and I made up on the spot as an improviser, like sort of a very simple, like, this is how I want everyone to have this experience of having the attention on you benevolently for like 5 seconds. And that was kind of the exercise. And everyone had this chance to kind of be in the spotlight a little bit and just sort of get over that bit of nerves. And then we had lunch, and the rest of the day was fine. And we didn't cover, let's say the last, 2 modules, because we spent more time in the earlier section to make sure that everyone got the group got what the group needed out of that session. And I think and that's something I guess that I can do because I've got a lot of experience, but I think anyone can be, as you said, like, we pay attention. We know on some level when the audience starts shifting, or something isn't landing, or there's a question, even if we're speaking to another person, you can see, whether they want to or not, this, micro expression of like, wait, what? Or, hold on, or they're trying to figure something out, and you can always stop. Okay, hold on. Does that make sense? And often the person will say no, or they'll say, hey, I get it. Or did you mean, they'll question you for clarification, and then you can move on. And it's just about not forgetting that connection that you have as a presenter with your audience.
Right.
So that's part 1. And then the part 2 is about memorization. And my personal feeling is, don't memorize. So what you want to do, I think, or the way I often coach people, is to say, you want to say the same thing every time, but not in the same way. So if you're a professionally trained actor, and you've got a script by Arthur Miller or William Shakespeare or whomever, then yeah, by all means, you want to get those word perfect. But, bless you and your listeners, you're not Arthur Miller or, Edward Albee or any, playwright. And so if we're a bit more playful with our language, or a bit more, we're like, okay, I know the points this is the topic of my presentation, to give an example. This is a topic of my presentation. These are the 3 main points I want to hit. And here's a couple supporting points for each of those main points that all support my main point. Then you need to know what all of those items are, but you don't need to neither memorize nor read them out. And I think that's the main thing. And I have a tip for how people can get better at knowing what they're going to say, but not memorizing, which is, if people use speaker notes, if we're talking about using, PowerPoint or Google Slides or whatever, and you're using speaker notes, and even for your slides, I would say right up until maybe even the day before, or even the morning of, you can tweak those components. So I think when stuff gets set in stone, if it's like, oh, I've got a presentation in 2 weeks, my slides are done, then there's this kind of over preparation that can happen where it gets too wooden because we just recite it, and then we can kind of recite it in our sleep. And then when we have to present, we kind of do recite it in our sleep. But if you're like, oh, I need to change these words, or oh, I want to move something here or there, it keeps it keeps it from becoming stale. So
Mhm.
I find that to be a really good technique for not letting your information get too stale and also keeping it from getting memorized because it can go into your long-term memory, but it doesn't get locked in as like this word and this line follow the line before all the way from beginning to end.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly planning ahead, visualization, right? You know, going through your remarks, just kind of getting comfortable with saying
Yeah.
what you want to say is all great. But I've never been an advocate for the memorization. And we could use, as an example, this medium, right?
Yeah.
Of podcasting, where I've, as on both ends of it, as a PR rep, supporting people who are being interviewed on podcasts, and then as a podcaster myself, where as long as you know what, I don't recommend having the exact questions, and then because then
Hmm.
people want to write out what they want to say, and then if it goes a little bit differently than how it's scripted, then you're losing your
Yeah.
place. If you have really spent time memorizing exactly what you want to say and then you forget, you're just much more inflexible, and
Yeah.
that frustration, and it's harder to adjust versus just having some notes for yourself to say, oh yeah, I wanted to say something about this, and let me just think about what I want to say instead of worrying about exactly what were the words that I had, right? And so it often has the opposite effect of what
Yeah.
somebody wants it to have, which is if it doesn't go exactly according to plan, which rarely it will, then it just puts you in a spot where you're having a hard time recovering. So that relates to, I guess there's the planning versus the presentation slash,
Mhm.
the performance part. And how weighted, I guess, do you think each of those parts are to a public speaking engagement, a presentation that's ultimately successful, the planning of coming up with what you want to say and what are the ideas and all of that versus how you actually deliver it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm thinking, though I haven't used this analogy before, but I'm thinking of the preparation as I'm thinking of it as like three dominoes
Mhm.
and preparation as the biggest domino, right? Like that's the one that will give you the momentum to carry through, the performance, the presentation and the performance. If you've got a really strong and clear idea of what you're going to say, and you prepare very effectively. And so like you just talked about, you're not memorizing, and this is, as you say, like it's so noticeable, for example, when an interviewer is not really listening, right? They're just like,
Right.
okay, next question. And then and everyone notices, but the interviewer is like, well, I'm keeping on track. But it's like the audience can hear that you're not responding to what's going on, and the person who's, being interviewed, the same. But if you're really prepared, then you know what you're going to say. Everything the other person is saying triggers something for you that relates more or less to the topic being discussed, and and it all can flow very organically. And that preparation is the big domino. And then the performance, a good performance can come from having the weight of that strong domino. Now, I have, for example, in my improv practice, one of the shows that I do is a solo improv performance that involves no preparation whatsoever. And it's a bit experimental, but it tends to go quite well. But the idea is that I'm relying only on what's happening in the moment. So I'm trying to sort of protect myself from relying on the preparation. So I go up there with kind of without any idea and then co-create with the audience what that show is going to be about. And that, tends to work very well, but not always. And that's part of the risk, part of the fun. But in general, I would say the more preparation you do, the better your outcome is going to be. And the example I use is Martin Short, the comedian,
Yep.
the actor Martin Short, Only Murders in the Building, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, etc. But when he goes on a talk show, and he's supposed to be he's like regarded as the best talk show guest of all time, but he sends in like pages and pages of notes to the show's producers. And then he gets on the phone for an hour and a half with the show's producer. There was a great article in Vulture about this. And then he does all this preparation and they winnow it down and they figure out exactly what he's going to talk about. And then he goes out there for 5 or 10 minutes and he can just relax, or as he says, do an impression of himself relaxed, because he says he gets very nervous. But it's because he knows he's got all that preparation behind him. So whatever comes out is going to relate to what they talked about, what they want to have happen, and he can just enjoy himself. And it's like, yeah, we're not all going to be on, Seth Meyers or with Conan O'Brien or whatever, but we can be inspired, or we can take that lesson and apply it to our own life, which is the more preparation, the more you can relax and enjoy yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great example, and certainly that, right, you're prepared doesn't need to mean knowing exactly what you're going to say, but it just means it's being prepared for the environment that you're in,
Yeah.
the audience you're speaking to, right? And how you want to present yourself, and what are some of the things that might work for them, and then putting yourself
Yeah.
in that place, and then knowing, okay, once I'm there, I have this whole variety of ways that I can relate to them, and it doesn't need to go exactly one way. Um, and knowing that all of that, the more, in that case, the more preparation, the more allows you to come off more naturally, right?
Yeah, it's the great irony of that. And I think we talked about that vicious cycle before, and I think I've identified, in some of my coaching and the trainings, where some people sort of you develop this mental block around public speaking or presenting. And so what do? They ignore it. They know they have a date in their calendar 3 weeks from now where they have to give a 10-minute presentation within the company, whatever. And they don't think about it, because when they think about it, it stresses them out. So they put it away and it sort of becomes this like gnawing dread. And so they're having this very negative association with it, and they're also not preparing. And then like the day before, they kind of panic, make a deck, or they borrow some existing slides and they put something together, and then they just put their head down and just like, this is going to be the terrible 10 minutes for everybody, but I'll just get through it. And then it's like, okay, so that's one way, to do it.
Yeah.
But it's that 3 weeks was shitty for you. That 3 weeks was tough for you, and for that presentation wasn't good for your colleagues. But what if we just a little bit, we're like, so have a conversation, what would you want to say? What would you want people to know? Or what did, sure, you ran some A/B tests and you thought they would tell you this, and instead it was a waste of time, or the company had to tighten their belt, and so that involves some difficult decisions. What did you learn? How did that affect you? What kind of whatever it is, and you start having these conversations, and then a little by little, as you go through that 3 weeks, you actually end up with something that is not just getting you through that 10 minutes of presentation, but actually has some value for you and for your audience. And I'm like, that's what we want.
Right. Yeah, that last point is key. And because, I want to talk about kind of the goal setting around this. And it's, I would, I guess, define like the goal of your presentation is to positively impact your audience. And based on the circumstances, there's different ways you might want to make an impact on them. But the goal is not to say what you want to say. The goal is not to, the goal is to prepare yourself to have a positive impact on the people who are there to listen to you. And I think that gets to one, I think, some people who struggle with this get tied up into a view of preparation that is
Mm,
probably not preparation, like writing
yeah,
it all out, right? And
yeah.
some people might say, well, if I write everything down, then I'm super prepared. To me, I might say, well, that's actually the least prepared you can be, because you're not actually preparing to deliver that. You're just
Mm,
writing it down and saying, good, now I can read it and it's in front of
right.
me. But are you actually prepared to give a presentation? And you can, just using a completely non-professional, layman's example of it, think about something like, the wedding toasts that you've heard,
Yeah.
right? And the exact same joke that somebody might have, how does it, what impression does it make on you when you see them up there reading it off a piece of paper
Yeah.
versus the person who is just, seems like they're just speaking? And I'm sure and a lot of people in those cases, right, who aren't professional public speakers, are thinking, wow, they just got up there and winged it.
Hmm.
No, I'm
Yeah.
sure that this person thought about what they wanted to say and put a lot of thought into it, enough so that they could get up there and speak without notes.
Yeah.
And every single time that I've been in a situation where I was up there speaking without notes, later on, I always say, "Oh, I forgot about this thing. I
Yeah.
forgot." Guess what? Who cares?
Yeah.
Because you're in the moment, and it was natural, and it was designed for the purpose of the people who were listening, for them to be interested in it and to feel like it was engaging. But to the goals piece, right? Because there's a variety of different strategies, techniques, and things that you write about in the book that people may use to spruce up their presentation and to
Hmm.
get it where they want to be. But I think it all depends on starting with, who am I speaking to? What
Yeah.
impact am I trying to make? What are the takeaways? Do I want them to be emotionally impacted? Do I want them to remember certain key points, etc.? But how would you talk through kind of that goal setting strategy as a way to then determine, all right, here's some of the techniques I can use to achieve that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it depends on in a way, it depends on the level, I think, of who I'm talking to, because for me, what I want from the person is I want them to be confident and competent, and so necessarily they need to, have a clear message and a clear idea of who they're speaking to, and those have to be intertwined, right? Because you can't have this, I need them to understand the specifics of how a rocket, manages to, get into orbit, or, like blast through the atmosphere. Like, your audience is like kindergartners. It's like, okay, I have to present that, I have to rethink my information, rethink my goal, rethink um, how I'm gonna get that across. And then it's like, okay, so in that case, you're going to talk more about like what's out in space, or whatever it is. You have to kind of take that same information and adapt it. And then it's like, oh, okay, no, now it's an audience of retirees or what, so and then you say, okay, I still want them to understand, but it's like, what am I going to use as an example? Or, it's like, okay, how does this, as we take flight and we think of it as like a journey, like life has been a journey, and or
Mhm.
whatever it is, and you kind of want to see how you can tailor that message to your audience. And I think you also need to think about what it is that I don't want us to get lost, and in terms of us as presenters. And I think sometimes, like, you got to think about your audience. Drum can get beaten a bit too hard. Like, think
Mhm.
about your audience. You got to think about your audience. And absolutely, you can't do it without the audience, but you also need to think about, like, what is it that I want to communicate? What is, my gift? What is it that I want to share? And gift may suit in some capacities, but not in others. But it's like, if you're in the head of a marketing department, let's say, like, what is your unique perspective? Like, what are you uniquely capable of saying? Like, what does your position and your knowledge of the background, not that everybody needs to know the background, but like, what can you in your position, what can you leverage in order to deliver something to your audience? And
Yeah.
to use your wedding toast example, which I think is a great one. I actually was coaching someone to give a wedding toast for his brother who was getting married, and here in the Netherlands. And as I was going through his speech, at a certain point, I was like, so I mean, a lot of this is good and like it's well written, but like this section here, like anybody could say it.
Yeah.
And same with this section here. And he goes, yeah, that I was Googling like what to say in a wedding toast. And though, but it was like clear to me what were these passages that sort of they're like, empty calories, right?
Right.
Because it didn't offer anything specific about his relationship with his brother, how they used to fight and how they used to make up, or like the special secrets that they had, or his relationship with the bride to be. And he was giving this presentation also with the bride to be's sister. And so, like that dynamic and all of these things, I was like, okay, once we start locking in on, that's where this starts to become like a really valuable exercise, for him. And then also delivering something unique and specific to that audience. And it's not just because of that context. It's like in any context, you are the only person, like especially with, chat GPT, or, like sort of these AI. If I want to, give me a 5-minute wedding speech and here's we were college roommates and we went, like whatever, we can type it
Yeah.
in there and they'll spit you out something, but it's going to have no heart or substance because a computer wrote it. You know what I mean? So like, where is your human value that you can give and then
Right.
give that?
Right. Yeah. And there's so many of those things that people who are listening, they know, even if they can't quite put their finger on it, right?
Yeah.
The example you mentioned earlier about the like in the podcast like this, if I have my list of questions and I'm just
Mm.
going from one to the next, no matter what you say, or if you have written down exactly what you want to say, people who are not involved in podcast 100% be able to say, oh, this is exactly what's happening there, but they can just hear that it's just not engaging. There's just something
Right.
about this that's not interesting. Or the person who has a bunch of filler stuff in their speech
Mm.
that they could say to anybody, any place. There's a disengagement that takes place
Yeah.
during that part. That there's stuff that really takes you out of it, that you'd be better off trimming it down and saying, let's just
Yeah.
stick to the stuff that really is relevant here. Let's not worry about what I'm supposed to say. Let's worry about what is going to make sense for these people, and focusing on that, and not worrying about that. It's really about, I mean, efficiency, I guess, in a sense, which, not to be confused exclusively with brevity, but saying, is everything I'm saying here worth saying? And so that doesn't mean it needs to be short or long or this or that, but it means if there's something that just isn't valuable to this audience, there's no sense in including it. If I have a lot of things that are valuable, great, right? But, not putting pressure on ourselves, like when we first learned to write in school, you would have parameters around, okay, this is a 500-word essay, or it's this many
Mm.
paragraphs or whatever.
Yeah.
And there still are plenty of adults who still operate by that. Okay, well, how long is this supposed to be? What's the
Mm.
versus? Then you get to the point where you're doing copywriting or different things, and it's like, all right, how short can I make this? I need to
Right.
this down. And realizing, okay, it's the economy of it, and the fact of I need to really ask the hard questions about what should be here and what shouldn't, and what am I, and if you're in a position where you're getting paid to give a speech somewhere, really being confident in what you are being paid for, right? Like
Yeah.
being confident in what your expertise and what your value is, and not thinking about it as I'm being paid to fill time, right?
Right.
And I'm being paid to give people something meaningful here. And if that takes me 20 minutes or if that takes 40 or 5,
Mm.
what is the most effective way to achieve that? And that's what they want from me, because I could talk for 2 hours about any, nonsense, right? And
Yeah,
I could say, well, I gave you 2 hours of my time. And well, yeah, but it
yeah.
wasn't worth anything to us, right?
There's a great quote, and I'm going to attribute it to Blaise Pascal, who I believe was a French mathematician, but I think it's also been variously attributed to Mark Twain and other people. But the quote is, please enjoy my letter. I'm sorry it's so long. I didn't have the time to write a shorter one.
Yeah.
And I love that. And when I teach writing workshops, which I also do, which is about, getting to the point, I always bring this up when we talk about editing. And I'm saying, this is what has happened here is they've written presumably a great letter. I mean, a man of letters, a great writer, but they didn't have the time to go back and sharpen the point, And I think what you're talking about, with like the 20 minutes, 45 minutes, 2 hours, and it's like, it's not the amount of blah, 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 like talking you're doing. It's the amount of, value or the amount of content and the amount of, it's like what you're giving. And, if you're like, okay, I've got a 20-minute slot, then give them 20 minutes of value. Don't take a presentation you had that was 10 minutes long that was really good and just kind of talk slower and stuff it with a few more examples and be like, I think I can pad this out and make it 20 minutes. And like it's like, no, give them like value their time and give them that 10-minute presentation that's really good. Say, I don't need that time slot. Or, take that and say, how else, where else can I, or it's not even what can I add to this? It's like, what can I, if I use this as a base, what can
Yeah.
I add to it to make that time valuable? Like how can I make this a worthwhile 20-minute presentation? And PS, if that 20-minute presentation only ends up being, 18 minutes, that's great because nobody has ever complained that a presentation ran short. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? That's not a thing that happens. So it's like pack it in and give the value and make sure that it is commensurate with the amount of time that you have to speak.
Yeah. How would someone go about getting meaningful practice and in, situations that are typically accessible, right? But something that's actually going to allow them to work on this.
Yeah, great question. There's lots, of course, like reach out to me for coaching. That's a great thing. But before you even do that, there's a lot of like slide guides or, that like these sort of AI powered, buddies that I think, are on PowerPoint and, with Google and Apple and all those that can tell you, okay, the pace was too slow here, or you used 8 times in the past, or, whatever. Those kind of those kind of tools, I would say absolutely leverage them. Also, even just, recording yourself or getting a roommate or, a partner or a child or parent to listen in. And that's really about the performance aspect, or, like this is the presentation. Let's see how that goes. But I think even before that, when you're generating this idea, let's say your boss is like, hey, I need you to do 15 minutes at the annual review. We're going to be looking back at this department and I want you to talk about this project that you were responsible for. You know, in advance of that, you're going to want to sort of test drive some ideas and like, okay, so this is because you're not just giving the facts. We had this budget, we spent this money, we did this thing, this is what happened. You're the value that we were talking about earlier is you're helping people, you're giving people the lens through which to view those facts, right? Like if it's just the facts, just, put it in an email. I mean, like, come on, you know what I mean? If you're going to actually help them, then you're going to want to say, well, so this is the interpretation of the fact. So when we look back at last quarter's activities, we can see that we underperformed in the following areas, A, B, and C. We know that because the results are X, Y, and Z here. Now we need to think about that as we're planning forward. And that is, we're looking at these following items and we're looking to see what can we cut and where should we be investing more or what, whatever. And we think that by doing that, we're going to achieve this results or we need these resources or this is the plan that we have. And then you're helping people use the past to make sense of what's happening now so you can prepare for the future instead of just like dumping a bunch of facts on people where it's like, this whole meeting could have been an email.
Yeah, I think that begs the question of what to do with feedback, right? What
Mm,
is, particularly in cases, I mean, number one, yes, like before you're going to come out on the other end comfortable and confident, lean into the discomfort,
yeah,
record yourself, right? No matter
yeah.
how good you are, you're going to hate it at first. Seek out feedback that you know is
Mm,
going to probably be critical, but you need to hear it. But also, once you get to the point where you know what you're doing, right, you're going to be sometimes in cases where you're receiving feedback or requests that you don't agree with, right? That
yeah.
you just reference giving those reports. I've been in situations working with clients where, we've given a report on the things that we know actually matter.
Mm,
And they're saying, well, we want these other things in here. And I'm thinking, do we want to waste our time on that? That's not really anything, right?
yeah. Yeah.
And you're sort of thinking, okay, there's the piece of just doing something that you feel like is kind of busy work or sort of besides the point just to satisfy somebody versus doing what you think is strategically correct. And that could apply to all different types of presentations, right? To say, look, I've thought about this and this was well thought out and presented, but I had an audience in whatever case that wanted to go by this very basic paint by numbers approach that
Hmm.
that their critiques are out of line with what I think is actually high quality. But as we're kind of getting into this and navigating that, how should a presenter go about getting and then actually using feedback?
That's a great question and like a whole, world to think about
Mhm.
because it also gets into, self-esteem and like where are our own blind spots and like who's paying the bills, there's all kinds of things. But I think a couple of things I want to say on this is one, there's a great idea, a term of the note behind the note. And so often, even if it's someone whose opinion you're like, oh, I don't really rate them as a public speaker, or I don't even think they're paying attention, or, they're just saying something. But if they're giving you a note, odds are they're identifying a problem and maybe the fix that they're suggesting is not very good. That where it's like, yeah, I think that whole section on like, between slides 4 and 8, I kind of tuned out. But what I think you could do is you could drop it and then like instead just skip or whatever. Or, it might not even be that specific, but let's imagine that it is. You're like, actually, that's the point of my presentation. But so I'm not going to drop it. But what they're telling me is that there's something that needs work there because that isn't landing with my audience. So I think
Right.
that's like a really valuable thing to like if we can get into this mindset of like looking for feedback and encouraging it, we also need to keep this integrity around our own work and not just be like, oh, well, I'll just whatever they say, I'm just going to change it and do that because then we're totally lost, right? But it's
Yeah.
like, okay, I can evaluate those notes and take them on board and see that, oh, okay, a few people have mentioned this thing and I think they're missing the point. But if two people have mentioned, independently, I'm not delivering the point. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
They're missing it, and that's not on them, that's on me at that point. So what do I need to do to go back and fix it? So I
Yeah.
think that's kind of a really important thing. And then the other thing I wanted to say is when you talked about like clients or people, like this is how we do this is the slide templates we use, or like you've got 4 minutes to deliver like all, whatever this massive Sisyphean task of whatever. And you're like, well, it's 4 minutes. Like I only got 4 minutes. And the phrase that I use in my head is like, all I can do is all I can do. like I can't do, I got 4 minutes. That's not going to change. I can't deliver all this. So what can I do? Or
Mm.
like, I've worked on this so hard, or I've told this client 5 times, 5 different ways that this is a bad idea. And this is what they want. If at that point, if I don't do that for them the way they want, I mean, you can debate this, but it's kind of malpractice, right? At a certain
Yeah.
point, it's like, okay, I told you, you hired me for my expertise. I told you, all these different ways. That's what you want. Okay, I'm going to do it. And like, and then I'm going to do it the best I can. I'm going to try and help you, coach you through the process. But this is what you asked for. This is what I give you, And then, of course, to maintain our own integrity, to go back to that point, maybe you need to walk out before that point, or maybe you're like, this relationship isn't working. You need a different person to deliver your work because this isn't a good match for you, or, whatever it is. But at a certain point, you're just like, all I can do is all I can do. So that's what I'm going to do, the most that I can within the parameters that I have.
Yeah, awesome. So Ryan, thanks so much for being here and sharing all of this with our listeners. If listeners are interested in learning more about your work or getting more insights and support on this, what should they check out?
Oh, thank you, Ross. It's been a great conversation, and thank you for having me. And the two best places to find me, one is if you want my book, it's called The Confident Presenter, and it's on Amazon and also other bookstores. But my name is Ryan Millar. That's Millar. You can find me on Amazon, or you can find me on my website, which is ryanmillar.com.
Excellent. Yeah, listeners, I will put the links below where you can learn more about Ryan and his book at his website. There's also a website, confidentpresenter.co, that you can check out. We'll put those links below and go to Amazon, wherever you get your books. The book is out there, The Confident Presenter. So we'll make that easy for you. Check all of that out. If this is something you want to learn more about, there are many tips, strategies, techniques that we didn't get into in detail here. But yeah, even if you are an experienced and confident public speaker, but you're looking for some little tips for how you can spruce up your openings, your intros, the different ways that you kind of format and engage your audiences, there's guaranteed to be something in there that you haven't tried yet. So check that all out. And also, if you're somebody who has something coming up, you look for quick tips, if you can find a copy of the book or an ebook that you can jump right to the back, and there's a bunch of strategies you can use right away, and then you can go through the rest of it later. So check that out if it's something that you would like to learn more about or that you would just like to be better at. Please also do subscribe to The Authority if you have not already for more author interviews like this one, or visit our network website, bpodcast.network, and you can learn about all of our 40 plus shows. Like this show, I'm sure there's something else for you there. Ryan, thanks again for being here.
Ross, an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.